works. I haven't really done it this way before, and I've taught this many times, so I'm always up for trying something different and new. So the whole process here, I guess let's just look at where we're at. Let us recap. We have the ball roll in, it rolls back. We don't really see that. I've modified my little range slider there. But I have the ball bouncing and squashing and stretching, right? But it always is staying directly upright. Now maybe it could be that way, I guess. That seems a little boring to me. It is a ball, right? And we did go to the trouble to have it roll in. So maybe it should rotate, somersault, flip, however you want to look at that. Now in doing that, normally you could select the, we'll just leave it right there. You could select the rotate control and rotate through, but the rotate control, because of being matched to the curve and that constraint, it gets a little crazy, right? You can see as I'm rotating one way, it's going the opposite way. So that's not gonna work for us, which means we have to use the move controller. If I rotate that, that looks good, right? But it's moving everything, which means these little deform handles. So let's go to some place where we have them stretched out, right? So here, probably don't want it stretched like this as it comes off the ground, right? So this is just gonna mean we're gonna have to take a little bit of care with how we do the rolling, the rotation, I guess, as this happens. So let's just dive in here. Let's do maybe one bounce at a time, or maybe I'll just do a couple bounces, an example, so you can see, and then finish this up on my own. But let's look at this first one. So as the ball comes up, I think that's okay. Maybe I'm not gonna worry about making that as a change. I could do a little bit of tweaking here, I guess, but I'll come back to that one later. So already this one is going to be going forward, so I know for sure I'm gonna have to make some tweaks to this rotation. So I'm gonna select just make sure I have the ball move control, and I'll key select here. And then I will grab my rotate tool. Now, if you're careful with this, so when God, there's so many curves on there, it's kind of hard to see. So you select an object, right? And you have the X, the Y, the Z rotate. You also have this blue handle over the top of it. So this would be to rotate it based on wherever the camera view is, right? So we could use this to our advantage if we're mindful of where the motion trail is, right? So if we can see that there, and if we're perpendicular to it, right? So if it's moving this way, the camera is pointing directly at it, or so perpendicular, right, to the direction that it's moving. Instead of grabbing the individual handles, I can just grab the yellow one and kind of do some rotating there, because this is going to be all over the place, right? It's not going to be perfect because we're not lined up along the world axis now. We came in at an angle. Yours is probably on an angle. So as you animate this, make sure you keyframe all three rotation parameters, right? So I can see how it's kind of leaning forward, right? It went from leaning backwards. You can see I can kind of tweak with that. I can even do things with, maybe it comes forward. And as I get to the peak, in fact, I'm gonna put one down right there. All right, and I'll get here at the top. And maybe what it does, it starts to rotate itself to get ready to squash and stretch. Right, it's like, see how it kind of gathers itself? And of course, these now will need to be exactly what this one is. So where am I at? No, it didn't do any. Okay. Right, so you can see it leans, it's kind of setting itself up. So I don't want it to squash over like that, right? Let's just go back to these. Flatten those out. You have to be careful. One thing that's happening, the squash and stretch, I think, is modifying just a little bit, but we'll leave that where it's at. Let's go back to this one. All right, so it comes forward. I kind of like that. But this one, what I'm going to do is make it rotate. Make sure I'm kind of lined up with that. Right, already that looks weird, right? You're like, what is going on? It's because we've totally messed with the squash and stretch. So let's just key that there. Right? So everything about that is wrong. So this is where we're going to have to grab. So it's kind of hard to see on the video capture. Maybe if I turn off the... There we go. And turn off the multi-sampling so it's a little bit easier to see that there. So now what I need to do is keyframe the squash and stretch. Right, so I just dumped it on its head, right? So let's just put it back the way it's supposed to. And I'm going to use that position, the motion trail to help me out. Let's see if I got that right. Right, so you can see I'm still making sure that I have that squash and stretch in that right angle. I'm going to keyframe there. So one thing to be conscious of is to make sure that your rotation kind of stops on the ground. I'm going to do it with this one as well. Right, and rotate. So just like with the position of the X and Z, well, the Y as well, right? Once we set it on the ground, we don't want it to rotate, right? So we'll just keep it there. And that squash and stretch seem to be pretty much in alignment. I could do a little bit of tweaking, but I'm not going to do that yet. I'm always going to do the tweaking of the squash and stretch after I've done the rotation for a jump. Right, so here, let's go back to we have the move control. And again, this is going to look really strange. And I'm looking at this, the idea that it's whatever direction it's going to kind of tumble. If you were making it maybe bounce side to side, maybe you would make it twist sideways, rotate sideways. But I'm going to make it rotate in the direction that it's moving. Right, so let's... Maybe do a full 180. Right, because I did a full 180, it didn't really have to do much with the squash and stretch because it's lined up pretty close to where it needs to be anyways, right? Maybe to make it a little more complicated, instead of doing a 180, I'll do something a little more. Okay, let's key that. Oops. I'm also going to key it again while it's on the ground at the same thing. Okay, you can see this is pretty messed up, right? All right, so now let's go back to our little rotate controller. So this is the squash and stretch corrective rotate controller. And as we get to where it lands, looks like that's at 214. And I'm just using that line. I'm just trying to run the line directly through the angle of its trajectory, right? Let's highlight those. So a nice thing here in the middle, the ball is going to be completely normal, right? It's not going to be stretched out, or it should not be stretched out, right? So it should squash and stretch as it comes off the ground, but here we're gonna make sure that it's just 0. So the squash and stretch controllers on the top and the bottom are 0. At this point, it doesn't really matter if my squash and stretch is lined up, as it's rotating through the object. It's not deforming it, right? Because it's at 0. I just have to make sure that as it starts to squash and stretch, as it starts to deform, I make sure that it's in alignment, right, with that trajectory there. And that looks pretty good to me. Maybe not perfect, but okay. So we're gonna keep there. I'm gonna keep it. All right. All right, let's see how well we did. Let's, I'm gonna hide the curves. The motion trail actually sits over here in the outliner, so if you wanted to, you could just hit H to hide it. Or we can, in fact, let's look with it. Oops. We'll look at it when it's on, and then we'll look with it off. But so you can see adding some rotation certainly gets it make it a little more lively, right? In fact, now that I look at it, I wish here at the beginning maybe I would do just a little bit of that. It's not so bad, I guess. There's a little shift going on there. I've got to figure out if that's the deform controller rotating, which might be the case, but I'll fix that here in a second. Let's just look at the rest first. And obviously I'm going to want it to rotate when it goes all the way up to the top. Let's go ahead and add that one. And I'm using Option or Alt 1 to show and hide the controllers. It's basically hiding the NURBS curves. All right, so the rotation need to be set. Let's just make sure that is. And as it goes all the way up, I'm going to treat it the idea that maybe it starts to finish its rotation. And again, I'm trying to use that motion path as kind of a guide for rotating this in a perpendicular fashion. Right, and maybe let's look at those. All those rotate controls. No, I want them to keep going. Make sure my time snaps on. Okay, let's see what I got. Yeah. Right, and I'm gonna have to I haven't really gone back to fix how this is going to work, right? And we'll maybe want that a little bit steeper. So that's not too bad. All right, so I'm gonna leave that there, but let's quickly recap. So we've got timing spacing up and down we feel pretty good about. Once we got there, we started working with the Z and the X translate so that it kind of moved around the space. Then we started animating the rotate. And again, that's a little trickier. I would save the version of the file before this one. And once you start doing the rotate, do a save as, so you have a different version, because the rotation is always tricky. Make sure that you rotate all three, rotate X, Y, Z, just because the way it gets calculated, it just, trust me. And after you feel really good in between the bounces of those rotations, then you can go back and just counter rotate your squash and stretch. You've already figured out the amount of squash and stretch that you want it to have. You just have to reorient it. And using the motion trail, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? I just had to line it up and make sure that that squash and stretch was pointed in the direction. You know, even if there's just a little bit of it here going on, you know, I can always come back and just add a little bit to the, you know, if I need to add a little bit of a corrective tweak to the rotation to make sure that that's lined up so that it's stretching or squashing along its path, right, along the trajectory. We want it to squash and stretch along this, not straight up and down, because if it's squashing straight up and down, but then moving sideways, that would not make sense, right? So make it squash and stretch in the direction that it's moving. And the motion trail really helps us figure that out, right? Okay, we'll leave it there and we'll see you with maybe a little cleanup tutorial. Then, in fact, the next one, I'm gonna tweak the landing, but the main thing is how to transfer the constraint from being constrained to the curve so that this controller is now constrained to the pillar, because we're gonna animate this rocking back and forth a little bit. Okay.